tonight's presentation isn't going to be as long as the last few meetings, but it is going to do kind of a recap of the process that we've gone through. It's been, I think in March, we began in 2012, so it'll be about 3 years. We'll kind of walk through the whole process, but the main goal tonight is to share kind of the final findings from the environmental assessment and announce the preferred alternatives as we move forward. Like Chad said, there are several folks here from both the city and DOT to answer any questions that you have. We are in the formal comment period for the environmental assessment, so if you do have a comment, certainly I'll take some general questions when we're done, but those comments we want written down because we have to respond to those, and at this time we'll get those. We'll actually write a written response to you and send you a letter with those, and also include it in the environmental assessment. So again, thanks everybody for being here. I'm just going to kind of hop into the timeline as it is just a little refresher for everybody. The project began in March of 2012, and most of 2012 we did data collection, we started on the traffic analysis, and we had our first public meeting in the mid part of the year. At that public meeting we shared several goals, asked a lot of questions, and shared some results from the online survey that we had. But it was really our first time to get some feedback on an area of town that many people are frustrated with. So we appreciate everybody that's been here from our first public meeting. You know, for some of you, projects that last 3 years seem like a long time. For me, a lot of the projects that we do last this long, and so it's the process that we need to go through to make the right decisions. As we got through 2012, we started generating some alternatives, which brought us to our second public meeting in 2013. And at that point, really, we had all these boards that were around the room. I think we had 13 options for the interchange and a various amount for the intersection. We shared those with you, got a lot of comments, and generated some additional options. And so the rest of 2013, we kind of worked on that in preparation for our meeting in 2014 that brought back all of those options and how we screened them. Even at that meeting, we touched on the alternatives that we're going to carry forward and report back to you during this meeting. And so throughout 2014, we've been working on finalizing the environmental assessment. And then just recently in December, we were able to get the draft environmental assessment signed for public availability. Doesn't mean we're done, but it means we're awful close. And also the IMJR. So we're kind of in the stages as we go into early 2015 is completion of the environmental assessment. And then finally, we can start thinking about design. So as we get into 2015, 2016, and 2017, we'll be working on preliminary, final design. We'll be coordinating with the landowners in preparation for construction to be in that 2019-2020 timeframe. Now we show the 2 years specifically because we believe it's going to take longer than 1 year to construct the entire project. And that doesn't mean we'll necessarily have construction all the way at the interchange and the intersection for 2 years, but it may mean that we have construction going on at one of those two places the second year. So that's just kind of the timeline to bring you up to speed. But we're going to kind of go back to the beginning and walk forward in a logical process on how we arrived at where we are now. If you remember back to the first meeting, we presented and we had all kinds of project goals for the interchange area. We had project goals for the intersection. We talked about whether we needed a crossing over the railroad tracks, all of these things. We had some ideas. You guys had some great ideas that we brought back, and what we created was basically tried to pile everything into some concise bullet points and made a deficiency summary of the project. And the whole point of this deficiency summary really was to lead us to our purpose and need of the project. So I'm just going to go through them. In this location over here, obviously we have one left turn lane that goes onto the interstate, the other one kind of goes through. We have a lot of people jockeying since there's only 2 lanes to get through that area, so we end up having a lot of crashes. Some of that's due to the lane configuration, some of that's due to just the congestion and capacity in that area. So that was one of the items. Certainly the ramps connecting onto Yeager Road versus connecting onto an arterial. We don't have that in Sioux Falls. This is about the only location where we have a connection from an interstate system to a collector road. So that's something that we want to solve with this project. Another thing that people see, especially in that evening hour, is the capacity on the ramp. If you're coming on 229, a lot of nights you see those lights all the way backed out onto the interstate, and that's something we need to fix. That can cause some serious accidents. So how do we manage and build capacity in this area, add the turning geometrics that we need to start clearing traffic off that ramp? As we move over to the east, trains crossing 26th Street are disrupting traffic throughout the day. Certainly when they come and hit those peak hours, that's of serious concern, but they also come in other hours of day, disrupting that traffic. And I know I see he's standing back here, our city traffic engineer, but if they come through in a peak hour, that can kind of affect traffic operations for almost 40 minutes. So that's significant for people crossing that side of town. And finally, as we look at improvements at the interchange, if we don't make improvements at 26 and Southeastern, it doesn't do us a whole lot of good. We need to make sure that as people are on that corridor, they can go all the way through as commuters and people that use the corridor and have a relatively safe experience going through there with additional capacity. So from those deficiency summaries, we popped right into our purpose and needs. So we use those to develop what do we need to account for with this project. So we'll kind of walk through those, improve the existing interchange configuration, provide grade separation, and now as we transfer in the purpose and need, as we talked about in the second public meeting, we need to satisfy these goals. They're not just put out there as we determine alternatives and create a new layout for this area. We got to make sure that we satisfy these. So provide the grade crossing, improve traffic capacity at 26 and Southeastern, and finally, consistency with the long-range plan. And interesting enough, we had a lot of folks that come at our second and third meeting that were really wanting the extension of the 4-lane section over to Cliff and even farther through town. And no one disagrees that would take more traffic. But one thing the city does is they develop plans on where roadway improvements should take place and where they might be detrimental to housing. And this is an area, and really it starts over on Kiwanis Avenue and comes all the way across on this corridor. And they identified this as a location that they didn't want to create those 4 lanes for the sake of those single-family homes that are along those corridors. So those are kind of our main purpose and need statements. We're going to kind of keep going. At our second public meeting, we brought those options forward. We had 13 options that we brought forward after the meeting from the comments that were received from the public and off of the website. We created 7 additional concepts that came out of that. So at the end of the day, we evaluated 20 different options against each other at the interchange. So quite a few, common for a project like this when you're looking at all the potential fixes that are out there. At 26 and Southeastern, we brought 6 options to the public at that meeting. We didn't have any new options that came out of it, but we did have quite a few refinements based on comments that we got from the public, so we appreciate that. Later in the year, I know you can't see that, that's the cover of the website. We actually posted the matrix, the screening matrix that we used to look at all the options against one another. That came out in October. And then later, early part of 2014, we brought those back to the public and gave you time to look at it ahead of time, and then we presented that last February. Evaluation of concepts stemmed around these items in relation to the environmental assessment. The purpose and need, so as we created this matrix, and this is just a small caption of what it actually is, it's a long page where all of them are compared against each other, but is the interchange standard for this area? Are future traffic needs being met? Is grade separation in accordance with the City of Sioux Falls policy? Is the option consistent with the long-range plan? How are property impacts taken care of out here? Do we have residential impacts or commercial? How are we affecting the park system? And we'll get to that a little later, because obviously with grade separation, we affect them greatly. Floodplains and wetlands, how much of the floodplains are we filling? The wetlands or the floodplains, how many linear feet are we filling in there? And finally, construction costs. And in planning studies like this, if we have construction costs that are relatively close, our margin of error is some. So if it's relatively close, we're saying that the cost is the same. We're not trying to pinpoint between a couple $100,000 on $35 million worth of improvements. But on our interchange option specifically, we had a lot that had a large difference in cost. At that same meeting in February, we talked about alternatives that were going to be carried forward. And this is kind of the first time you'll see on the layouts here tonight where you're kind of seeing a mix. We have 5A and A. And really what that means is we've combined the interchange layout of 5A along with the intersection layout of A. And so as far as the environmental assessment, we need to make sure that we see the full picture. And we did that. And these boards show you those options together. And so from that meeting, we carried alternative A, 5A and 7A from the interchange, and we carried from the intersection A and C. And as we go along, we're always considering that no-build alternative, as that may be the alternative if we can't find a solution. So underlined reds, these are the ones we carried forward. And now I'm just going to kind of quickly run through the benefits and the drawbacks of the options. These are just captions of the layouts that are over there. This is 5A and A, so this represents our west side diamond interchange where we have the ramp that begins and is elevated by Cameo Way, comes up to the intersection here, and then the ramp goes back on to get to the interstate. This side is relatively the same. We didn't recommend any improvements to this long ramp because we need that length to receive the dual left turning movements that we'll have at that ramp. So we didn't look at consolidating it because we need that length for the 2 lanes to merge to 1 as they go on to the interstate. But just a few benefits. Certainly this one will serve the traffic demands that we have forecasted and what are existing. These options, specifically because of the longer bridge we're using, we have minimal impacts to the Big Sioux River floodplain, actually some improvements, we'll talk about that. We have minimal widening west of Yeager Road, and we point that out as regards to the consistency with the long-range plan. And this option allows for grade separation over the railroad. And so those are some of our benefits. Some of the drawbacks, and they kind of relate back to cost, but this bridge right here in 5A, we have to totally reconstruct that bridge. It's not that old. Certainly when we do these projects, we try to expand them if we can, if it's a type of bridge that we can expand. But the angle of the ramps, how they're tied into the bridge, we can't make that work with the existing bridge, so we need to replace it. The other item is the bridge that we need to construct here over the Big Sioux River. So those things, we're calling them drawbacks only because they increase the cost of the project. So when we look at the screening matrices in the comparison, that's a big cost. I'm just going to kind of go through. This is, when we look at the bridge location here up to the interchange, if you remember from the last public meeting, this was kind of the wall. So I don't have it up here as a drawback really, but the folks along Cameo Way, if this option were selected, this is kind of the view that they had. We had concerns with drainage going down the interstate right-of-way. Certainly visual impacts were concerning to them. So we had some other issues, if we went with this option due to this wall. And finally, certainly a drawback to any options if we have property impacts. In alternative A for the intersection where we keep southeastern on alignment, we have several we have 2 commercial properties that would be impacted and about 7 other residential properties that would be impacted. So those are certainly drawbacks. We're going to go on to option 5A here. So anything that we talked about on the last slide is consistent, but now in this option we're looking at alternative C, which is southeastern is off alignment. It's pulled closer to the railroad. And so a couple items here. This top one is certainly true. Forecasted demands we meet. Minimal impacts to the floodplain, again, because of how we looked at the bridge design. But we looked at another benefit as being redevelopment opportunities in this southeast quadrant. And the other thing is the additional separation that we get to these businesses. And I'm going to kind of go through this. I'm going to stop this at a few locations, but this is kind of the animation for intersection C, and I want to point out those, why we believe that they're benefits. Okay, at this location specifically, in option C, we create a large amount of green space. And so if you're the business owners in here, if we're on option A, that retaining wall runs right along their property. And so when we look at being able to create additional space in here, we can also adjust some of the visual impacts that we have. And so by providing additional green space during our preliminary and final design, we'll look at reducing these walls, certainly making it so the road doesn't appear to be right on top of those properties. That's a benefit. Now we're going to keep going and we'll talk about the other quadrant. Okay, I'm going to stop it right here. At the last public meeting, we talked about the benefits of alternative C, being able to provide access to all of these properties. And that was one of the benefits that we had. As we go through the process and we start carrying forward alternatives, that's really where we take additional time to dig in to all the other things that we need to take into account. And so things that we kind of learned as we were getting into the carry forward stage is, one thing that we got to do is we have a sanitary sewer line that runs down 26th Street. And with a fill of about 25 feet in this area, obviously we want to not have the sanitary sewer in that location because we'll never get back to it. It'd be very difficult. And so we needed a place to put that sanitary sewer, and really the only available option that we had was to come through this area. So that was an impact that we didn't really anticipate right away. We thought we'd be able to keep all these, build the walls, and as we looked into utilities, that just wasn't the case. So that made us start looking at, well, maybe we won't be able to save these commercial properties like we originally hoped for. The other item is construction staging. As we build this area through here, we need some room for the contractor to work. And this is really the only viable area for them to do that. We had other concerns about snow maintenance in here. I mean, we're basically creating an area that's in the kind of an area that'd be hard to get snow out of there, and some other items. But that's really some of the decisions that led us to saying, well, even in this option C, you know, it's probably going to be difficult to save those properties. But we do say, you know, certainly potential for redevelopment, because when we're all done, we don't need it for construction staging anymore. The sewer will be in place outside of that roadway. We'll have some easements, but that area certainly could be redeveloped at that time. Probably find a good land use for it. So we'll kind of keep going. You know, with this option, really the major change is the condo units that are here, those would be able to stay there, which would be a benefit, and maybe these would turn into some sort of condos as well, or other land uses that the city approves. Now we're going to skip over from the 5A interchange alternative to 7A, and this is the west side loop ramp configuration. Again, this option will service the traffic volumes that we have. Minimal impacts to the river, and that's all down in this area. So between the options, that really doesn't change. Bridge construction is far reduced. So if you look at the graphic now, the existing bridge that sits here, we're just going to widen to the south. Not only does that reduce the overall cost, but it certainly allows us to have an easier time sequencing the construction. If we're not ripping up that old bridge, we can use it to get people across on 26th Street from the east to the west. Some of the drawbacks of this design is, and we talked about this at the last meeting, the radii of this loop. And you know, we say it's a drawback primarily because when the DOT, if they were in a rural area and had the opportunity to build the interchange exactly how they wanted, they'd make that loop a little bit bigger. Okay, we're in an urban area, we got homes, we got all these things that we're trying not to impact. And they're very common to be this size and even much smaller. Rice Street, the ramps up there are much smaller. Various areas around town they are. So one thing I just kind of wanted to point out is this yellow portion here, that's the ramp that we're looking at. The orange portion is if we increased it to 250-foot radius versus the 190. And what that happens is we start getting in with the Yeager Road relocation, we start getting into more property impacts in this area. And we don't have any information that would indicate that that ramp would really work better than the one we're proposing. And we've done a lot of study on it and worked with the DOT. So we're comfortable it'll work. Certainly, by keeping it tight, we have less property impacts than we would if we widened it out. But the other drawback is by making this connection with the Yeager Road, we do have two property acquisitions that are required here and two partial acquisitions. So that's certainly a drawback. Alternative 7AC, so all of the items that we talked about still pertain here. And really everything we talked about in the last option in 5AC pertain here. So this option, no different. We still have really just the condos that would be able to stay in that southeast quadrant. Now I'm just going to kind of take you back and say, okay, how does this all fit together? Well, in relation to the public meetings, public meeting 2, we announced that the project was being transitioned from a corridor study into an environmental assessment. And that's something we didn't know when we had public meeting 1. And the reason for that is the city and the DOT knew that they wanted to begin with improvements shortly after the study. And if we'd have done a corridor study and completed that, they basically would have had to start again on the environmental assessment. So they kind of just changed things up and we took off with the environmental assessment. So at public meeting 2, the items that we covered were the approach and scope. We brought a purpose and need statement, and we showed you alternatives. So that was kind of the first steps as we build up to completing the environmental assessment. Public meeting 3, that's where we came back with the screening matrix and talked about the evaluation of the concepts. And so finally with public meeting 4, we're at the selection of the preferred alternative. And so we're kind of getting to the top of our pyramid here. Really, we'll take the comments that everybody has from this meeting during our comment period of the environmental assessment. We have to ensure that we respond to all those. And then finally, we would ask for signatures from DOT and Federal Highway for the final approval of the study. These are just some environmental assessment summary boards. For alternative 5A, we have 7 acquisitions, 7 residential and 2 commercial. Noise, we spent a great deal of time with noise. We have our noise boards in the back at the last meeting and kind of went through those in great detail. But if you want to talk about the noise, certainly grab me afterwards and we'll go back through it. But what we found out is in this area, due to the urban nature, the noise really wasn't changing. As we looked at option 5A, if you remember, when we placed this bridge and placed that wall up to the intersection, so the homes over here, we actually reduced the noise because we basically are blocking that interstate traffic. And so although we provided some visual impacts, concerns about drainage, that did have a positive impact. It would really act the same thing as a noise wall. So that's what we talked about there, and that's why we say it wouldn't substantially increase for this area. On this side, we have the ramp as close as we can, certainly another reason for that. Floodplain impacts, wetland impacts, as we go through the slides, they're all generally similar because they exist in this area where the options are almost identical between the two. Section 4F, as we finish this, I'm going to get into our park mitigation plan, and that's the Section 4F, that's park uses. In Section 6F, we show temporary non-conforming use, and that would be for the recreational trails. And why we say it's temporary non-conforming use is really we're going to disrupt it to some extent during construction, but when the whole project's done, the trails will still be in place. On our board, you'll notice that during construction, our plan is to place a box culvert that would start over here and go over here so you could ride through the project safely while they construct over the top of you. And those are things that allow us to get that temporary non-conforming use. So that's a good thing. 5AC, really not any other differences. You know, we have just the less acquisitions, but all the other stuff is basically the same. Now we get to 7AA, and again, the major obstacle here is the acquisitions between the residential and the commercial. The other options are similar in nature based on this configuration versus existing. We're not having a great deal of noise differences, and it kind of makes sense. I mean, everything's still kind of consolidated in the same area. And on the north side here, we're really only looking at adding a little area along the interstate for deceleration for that loop ramp. That's about it there. And same here, the acquisitions, certainly in 7A and 7AC, we have more than in the 5A options. But again, that's kind of the summary of the environmental items. In regards to analyzing 4F, I know we had a lot of folks ask questions in the early part of 2014 after our study. It's like, well, when are we going to see you again? And boy, it's been a year since we've seen everybody. And so this 4F impact was one of the kind of the largest things that we had to overcome with the project, and trying to figure out how to handle if we're going to build grade separation on 26th Street over the railroad, and we closed the park entrance. You know, how do we fix that? And so that took us a long time working with the Parks Department, the Parks Board, the Parks Committees, as a group with the DOT City. It was just it was difficult to find out and get a plan that kind of put back what was there. That was our goal, not to maybe do all these enhancements, but really to give them the park similar to what they have out there now. So, but as far as the 4F process, we identify the properties within the study area, Riverdale, Rotary, Norland, Paisley, and the Big Sioux Bike Trail. Then we go through and identify the impacts. Well, what we found to be the impacts were really the park entrance issue and then our temporary construction impacts. And so we have to figure out how to work through those. So we develop measures to mitigate or minimize, and that's where we come up with the Rotary Norland Park Mitigation Plan, and we'll pop to that next. But tonight we'll certainly review and comment on that plan, and those we'll certainly share with the Parks Department. They'll be happy to hear those. And finally, we're looking for that park concurrence, and so far we've got approval from the park board, the park committees, and finally we're waiting for just kind of a final reassurance from the public that we're on the right track. Some of the highlights from that mitigation plan, just kind of orientate you. 26th Street here, Southeastern Avenue right here. This is the location of the existing entrance at grade, right at the railroad tracks. And really what we're proposing, there's no way to come from 30 feet in the air and get down into the park. By the time, if we even built a ramp, we'd eat up all the land that exists. And so we said, well, this is Rotary Park. We're not creating new Rotary Park. This has always been Rotary Park. The current use is really for the canoe area. And so we had a sub-consultant that works on a lot of park master plans. I got them on board, and they really put their hats on trying to say, okay, how can we put back what we're going to take away? And so they developed a plan where we're looking at relocating the entrance across from Cliff Avenue Greenhouse. And as a traffic engineer, I love that because we're not so darn close to the intersection up here. It's in a much better spot. And so people can get in. We'll allow to have the same amount of parking that exists out there now. There'll be the playground, restroom, and shelter facilities, no different than are on this side. Even for the time being, even when our project's done, these uses are going to stay over there for the foreseeable future. If they last 20, 30 years, a lot of people play on those. If you go on the trails, man, it's just solid busy all the time. So if you want to get from the parking area over to the trail, you're going to get there over a ped bridge. And this one will be a little bit different than some of the ones that are in town. If you ride on the bike trail quite a bit, you notice that the bridges kind of go way up and they come way down. And they're doing that to make sure that they don't infringe on the area needed for the floodway. What we're looking at doing here is putting a lower bridge in, something that if you drive across, you don't come right down onto the path, because we had a lot of people that said, just seems like you're always shooting down off those paths. And so we did some research and found some bridges that we can build within the floodway and have breakable like railings on them. And so they would close if we had those higher events. The railings could be expanded so they don't block flow. And so I think people will like that. That's done in a lot of cities around the US. So some other items, one thing we talk about is repurposed. Right now, if you come into the park, there's parking lot here, and then there's a road that takes you down to additional parking on Norland Park. And so we also got to figure out, we replaced the parking over here, but kind of how do we repurpose that other roadway and the amenities on Norland? And we did that by adding a secondary trail. And for those of you that use this path, know how busy it is. So in this area, it'll be very nice to be able to either go right on through or maybe spend a little more time in the open green space at Rotary Park off that secondary trail. And so we have a board in the back that covers all of the items with the mitigation plan. Certainly can go over those with you, but we believe that we come up with a good alternative for really mitigating some of the problems that we created with our design, but we think it's a win-win. So finally, we're down to the selection of the preferred alternatives. We'll start with the interchange. The preferred alternative is 7A. In comparison to the no-build option, we certainly have to look at that. The no-build option does not meet the project need. It doesn't provide a standard interchange configuration, and we're not relieving the traffic congestion that we have out there. The interchange alternative, just kind of some bullet points here on the benefits. The construction cost is about $6 to $6.5 million less than alternative 5A. So when we look at construction costs, like I said, if there had been $1 million between the two, it would have been negligent. But when you start looking at 5, 7, some of the interchange options were $15, $20 million difference. Then it becomes something that we need to consider in our alternative selection. The southbound off-ramp allows for free right turns. This is a benefit if you get off the interstate and you want to go eastbound. Right here, you won't stop to get into traffic. You'll actually enter your own lane. And so when we look at traffic capacity between 5A and 7A, we have just a little bit more under this option, which is kind of nice. And that third lane will continue all the way over to Southeastern. And finally, the property acquisitions are certainly a drawback. We don't want to say that they're not or shed light on them, that it's not a big deal. But even when we look at the cost of those acquisitions, we're still talking a project cost of 35 to 40% lower for alternative 7A. Now we're going to hop over to alternative C, which is the preferred alternative for the intersection. Again, against the no-build option, we're not following the city's policy for grade separation at this location, so we're not meeting the purpose and need. And then the intersection capacity, we can't improve it at grade. We can add right turn lanes and some of those things, but it's very difficult to do that in the constraints that we have. Again, some of the benefits, we do allow for redevelopment, and so if we do have to have takings, we certainly want to be able to put something back there. And so this allows us to do it by redeveloping this part of the southeast quadrant. And like I said before, it impacts come from construction, staging, utilities, access, visual, just many different things that we looked at in that area. And also this provides much better separation with the existing businesses. And at the end of the day, we didn't change their access. And when we met with those folks, that was the biggest thing. You know, they want to make sure that their patrons that come off the interstate can get to their businesses just like they do today. And finally, I'm just going to touch on the traffic sequencing for the project. I had a lot of folks, a lot of business folks come up to me after the meeting last time, and we're really concerned about whether this project would maintain traffic on 26th Street. And I'm telling you, we do not have all the answers, but we did look pretty hard at just 26th Street. And so we'll just pop through a couple of the cross sections. As we said in option 7A, we'll be widening this bridge to the south. And so that allows the existing portion of the bridge to be open to traffic. And so this blue area here, that would represent the widening that would take place. We'd fill this portion in with a raised median, so when we're done, you're not really going to know that there's additional bridge. It won't be apparent to you. The only really thing we're looking at this side is maybe expanding the width of that sidewalk, and so which would be an amenity for people to cross in that area. In the location of the Big Sioux River Bridge, this is the cross section. This is the existing bridge through here. This just indicates the widening that took place in the 80s to make that a 4-lane. But our bridge, obviously, to get over the rail is way up high. And you've probably seen projects around town where we've had to adjust the elevation of bridges and build right next to it. 41st Street over the river, we changed that 4 feet of elevation difference. And so we do this quite frequently, and it allows us to move traffic from one side to the other. So this is a new technology. But we would build this new bridge starting over here while we're maintaining traffic on the existing road. And finally, the other constriction point was really as we go up the hill. Right when we get by the east side of the intersection here, that area we're about 25 feet in elevation difference. So we have all this fill that needs to take place. And so we look at keeping traffic on the north side of the road for at least the first phase, keeping traffic over there while we widen and build up that side. And if you can see the method to our madness here, when we do that, we're able to build all of the south side of the project. And so when we're done with that side, we can switch traffic and use that side to keep 26th Street open as we go through. Now, the other questions are going to be, can we keep the ramps open all the time? How are we going to affect Southeastern? We're going to affect them. The ramps here, we can deal with the ramp closures. We can build some temporary shoe flies at the end of the ramps to tie into different locations so we can finish the final surfacing to minimize those. So we have a good perspective on how we can handle that. But over at Southeastern, We will be shutting portions of Southeastern down during this project. There's no other way to build it. In this first phase, we show shutting the south side down while we maintain it as a T. For those folks that go downtown to work every day can come back, get on 26th Street, and find an alternative route. Now, between this project ending or getting constructed, we'll certainly be looking at other items that can be done to increase capacity on some of these other streets, maybe restriping or signals or temporary signals during construction, but we'll consider those. But I did want to address at least 26th Street and keeping that open during the project. And finally, comments. Like I said, we're in the stage of the environmental assessment that it's out for public availability. And so what we really want you to do is draft a comment, either leave it with us tonight or send it back to us. Our forms are longer this time, so you have more room to write on. We'll take those. We got to respond to each one. That's protocol of the environmental assessment. We will send you a letter back indicating how we addressed your comment. And we need to do that before we can move into those final stages. So please do that. The website's here. This is the events documents page. And so the environmental assessment and the appendix are located right here. The interchange justification report's here. All of the renderings that we provided at past meetings or any of the presentations that we have, it's all on there. So anything we know, you can go right on there. All of the captions that I have in the presentation, I clipped those right out of the environmental assessment. So they're the same as you can view at home. So please use that tool. It's been very useful for us. You know, by the end of the month, that's where we're looking at getting comments back. That way we can continue into February, address those comments and final out this part of the project. And like I said, the next project would be actually moving into design.